بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه. Brothers and sisters, we continue in our series on Maqasid in this blessed month of Ramadan. Happy Ramadan to everybody. May Allah accept from all of us. And may He give us the benefit from this series that endeavor to cover the different theories of Maqasid with application on case studies on the current pandemic crisis. Today, we're very happy to have with us Dr. Jasser Auda. Dr. Jasser Auda is a scholar and distinguished professor of Islamic law, in particular the study of higher purposes of Maqasid, or the objective of Sharia. He's the president of Maqasid Institute Global, which is a think tank registered in the United States, UK, Malaysia, and Indonesia. He's a very prolific author in the area of Maqasid. His education stemmed from some traditional education at Al-Azhar, and with a PhD in IT, and another PhD in philosophy, and the topic of his PhD was Maqasid, and he published a few books in this area. We had the pleasure to host him here in Calgary physically in 2015 at the end of a previous Maqasid series we've done in 2014, and he was the keynote speaker, and we enjoyed him face to face here at University of Calgary. Today he's going to animate a topic entitled Maqasid Methodology, where he's going to talk to us about a new Maqasid framework he's working on. And without further ado, Dr. Jasser, please.
MashaAllah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's such a pleasure to be back. Exactly as pleasurable as we had in 2015. It means a lot to see people face to face and to sit down and have some nice food and nice conversations. But it's not, alhamdulillah, a total separation. We have this separation through this means, and I'm really happy to be back to Horizon and the good work that people there do. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Nordin, and my brothers and sisters in Horizon for inviting me again. It's remarkable that you have this interest in the Maqasid framework and the Maqasid approach over the years. And as an educational institute, it's very important, in my view, that you focus on Maqasid, not just Maqasid al-Sharia, but Maqasid al-Islam in general, which I will talk about today, which I think is crucial for an Islamic education that is authentic and comprehensive, an Islamic education that deals with the challenges of the time adequately. It's very important to take this approach. In order to take this approach, though, wherever I go and speak about Maqasid, I face the question of how. So how can we apply Maqasid to today's issues? Like, we have a pandemic today, and we would like to think about it. I am an epidemiologist, I'm a physician, I'm a counselor, I'm an activist, I am an average Muslim. I would like to think about a reality through a window of Maqasid, or an approach, or what you called rightly a framework. And I will present today two things: a Maqasid framework and a Maqasid methodology, both, and I will explain the difference. And so in the Maqasid Institute, which I had, we have been working through a network of researchers on this methodology, trying to apply it. And I will present, inshallah, some of our findings. The development of a Maqasid methodology through the Maqasid Institute researchers and how this methodology could help tackle contemporary issues. So if I go back to the presentation outline, so basically I will start with some premises that are at the same time conclusions. And this is what we learn from the Quran. When you read the Quran, the beginning of the reading, whether you read from Al-Fatiha, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, Rahman Rahim, or you read from Iqra, I mean in the order of Revelation, Iqra Bismi Rabbika Alladhi Khalaq, and then you go surah after surah, there are concepts and terminology that you might not be familiar with. And then eventually, as you finish the reading of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you will start to have more information about what you did not understand at the beginning. So basically, those cycles of reading would inform you so that the premises you start your next reading with are the conclusions that you get from the previous reading. Hence, the premises / conclusions that I am presenting here to start with, because they are certain statements that we concluded from the research, but we will start with them, our presentation of the research itself. And then I will explain a Maqasid framework through which we can analyze and we can understand the reality or history, or when we apply the reality in the sense of a phenomena, how we can analyze a certain phenomena through that framework. And then I will go from the framework to a methodology that is a step-by-step process through which we are employing, utilizing the framework in order to come up with the research that we are aiming at working at. So the framework is the composite worldview, if you wish, and the methodology would be the step-by-step process that we go through in order to deal with that worldview. And then I'll talk about reconstructing contemporary scholarship through that, looking at the phenomena. The basic premise is, first of all, revelation centrism. And then I'll talk about centrality of the maqasid in the revelation, and then methodological maqasid to generate a general framework, cycles of reflection, and phenomena as basis for study and action. The revelation in Islam is at the center of your perception and action. A true Muslim does not really separate the religious matters from the secular matters. A true Muslim looks at everything through a worldview, through an Islamic worldview that defines concepts, defines faith and non-faith, defines good and evil, and not just that, but defines the things and the matters and the groups of people, and defines everything through that lens of al-wahi, or the revelation. Are we asking too much from the Quran? A brother asked me recently, and my answer was no, because we are not saying that the Quran is a book of medicine or economics or engineering or history or psychology, but we're saying that the Quran is necessary for any Islamic approach to any of these fields. I really cannot approach history without the Quranic premises for history, because the Quran is telling me how humanity started and how it was. Humanity did not start with no knowledge and then eventually accumulated knowledge. Humanity started with all the asma, all the names Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given. Humanity did not start with no religion and then eventually a mixed up religion and then eventually ended up with monotheism and this kind of thing that some anthropologists tell us. No, humanity started with religion and law and everything. And then, yes, technologically speaking, we went through phases. And obviously, after the flood, we had to start from a primitive point. But the Quran is giving me some premises through which I can start looking at the basic questions of history. Economics, the Quran is not going to give me economic equations and so forth and the technical of it, but the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of course, as a bayan, illustration of the Quran, will give us some premises, not just akhlaq, not just the ethics of it, but also some basic premises, economic premises. An economy with interest is different from an economy without interest. An economy where the allegorically, like the monopoly or what's it called, the name in English, the dula, the circulation of wealth amongst the rich is allowed, is different from an economy where the circulation amongst the rich is not allowed, as we have in Islam. But sometimes the secular thinking, and I will go quickly through introduction, inshallah, to get to the framework. Sometimes the secular thinking, based on the history of colonization in the Muslim world, and sometimes based on the history of tyranny, which separated the scholars from, public life early on in our history after half a century of Hijri years, and so forth. Sometimes the history of secular thinking and the current reality of secular thinking make us think in those two silos, the silo of Islam versus the silo of anything else, economics or arts or medicine or even design. Design is not value free and philosophy free. Design is full of philosophy and full of value that Islam presents. So then next, one of the final conclusions that would be a premise here is the centrality of the Maqasid in the revelation. There is nothing in the Quran, the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is mentioned without a purpose, without an end. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created jinn and ins to worship Him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked us to fast Ramadan so that we acquire taqwa. He asked us to slaughter the animals so that we can feed the poor, and that, again, taqwa. He asked us, subhanahu wa ta'ala, to perform certain rites in a particular way so that we achieve certain things. The family law is not just a rigid law. Every rule in the family law has a wisdom behind it, has a why that the Quran is talking about. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning the creation of mountains and rivers and plants and animals, everything with a reason that comes right after it, or comes a few verses later, or comes somewhere in the Quran that you link through a network logic kind of thinking, and then you link the creation of the mountains for the sake of the balance on earth with the other place where the creation of the mountains is mentioned without that link. And therefore, the maqasid, or the objectives, are central in the Quranic logic, in the Quranic way of explaining Allah's rules, subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah's creation, and His commands, and everything is rationalized through a purpose. Therefore, when we read purposes in the Quran, this is not a foreign logic to the Quran. The Quran's logic is a purpose-based and an objective-based logic, much more than causality. If you look at causality versus teleology or purposefulness in the Quran, you will see that yes, the Quran is talking about causes, the water from the sky and planting the plants, etc., fire and burning. But you will find that the causal logic in the Quran is much weaker than the purpose logic. The purpose logic is futuristic. When I think about why or about an objective that I'm trying to achieve, I'm thinking about the future. I'm fasting so that in the future I would acquire taqwa. When I ask why and when I think about the end or the purpose, it's also a critical approach, because the why opens the area or the window for criticism. When you ask why for anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed, or anything that you see in the world. The Maqasid approach is a holistic approach as well. That is part of it, when you look at justice in total, or equity, or mercy, or the common good, or any of the other maqasid of Islam in the Quran, you will look at the bigger picture. And that holistic approach is also part of the logic of the maqasid of the Quran. The maqasid approach is a practical approach, because the objective, the why, is always an outcome that you are trying to achieve, whether in the material sense or an outcome in the what we call the spiritual sense in English, or in Arabic would be al-qalbi, the heart sense, something about your heart or about the common good. And the why question is a multidisciplinary, and I would say transdisciplinary question by definition, because there is no one reason for any phenomena. There are many reasons and there are many issues. We have a crisis now with COVID-19, not just because of the medical dimension, but because of the economic dimension, and because of the political dimension in some countries, and because of a psychological issue that some people have, and so forth. So when you have a crisis, and when the Quran describes a phenomena, it doesn't describe it only from one particular end, as like a medical phenomena or an economic phenomena. Poverty is not just an economic phenomenon. Poverty has a lot to do with politics, has a lot to do with management and organization, has a lot to do with the law, how the law is done and practiced, and how the courts work, and how the system functions, the social system, if there is racism or there is something in a society that could enforce poverty, and so forth. So therefore, phenomena that the Quran is dealing with, when you look at the deeper purpose and the objective and so on, you are looking at a multidisciplinary and rather a transdisciplinary approach to any phenomenon. And therefore, it's really a shift in the paradigm when you look at the purposes and the objectives, and you try to reason what is happening based on the why, which inshallah I will get quickly into. There is another premise here, what we call the methodological maqasid, or al-maqasid al-manhajiyya. So basically, we were looking at what did the Quran aim at achieving on the methodological level. I'm going to get into that. And we ended up with those 7 methodological objectives: realizing the objectives, correcting our concepts, classifying groups, aligning with the universal laws or the sunnah al-ilahiyya, following values or al-qiyam, establishing proofs or al-hujaj, and acting on commands or al-amalu bil-awamir. And therefore, we have 7 fundamentals of maqasid studies. Based on these maqasid, based on realizing the objectives, we're going to look at the objectives in any phenomena. Based on correcting the concepts, we're going to look at al-mafahim, or the concepts. Based on classifying groups, we're going to look at al-fi'at, or groups. Based on aligning with the universal laws, we're going to look at as-sunan, or the universal laws in Islam. And based on following values, we are going to look at al-qiyam, or al-qima, the value. What is a value? And how we can define it and read it in the Quran. We're going to look at proofs, or al-hujaj, or the kind of logic, really premise and conclusion that the Quran is giving us, and how it deals with issues, logically speaking, in addition to al-maqasid as a core logical tool in the Quran. And then we're going to look at al-awamir, or the commands, at different levels of command. Then another premise here is that a cycle of reflection will develop theories and principles. As I mentioned in the beginning, when you read the Quran the first time, you might not understand certain things, certain classifications of people, certain concepts, and so on. But then eventually, as you have these cycles of reflection, you start to link different places in the Quran and the Sunnah. I will describe, of course, how the Sunnah is crucial for the understanding of the Quran. And therefore, you start to develop principles and theories. And that is, to me, the true fiqh of Islam. Fiqh is not just about the rules. It's about developing a framework that generates principles and theories through which we can deal with the reality. So basically, with the cycles of reflection, we are able to develop theories and principles. When we connect what we read in the Book of Allah and the Sunnah of His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that connection, I was saying, is the true fiqh. Because fiqh is not just about the commands. The commands, as you will see in the framework, is just one side of what Allah and His Messenger say, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But other than the commands, we are connecting the objectives and the concepts and the universal laws and all of the other dimensions of a framework, a composite and a comprehensive framework. So the cycles of reflection will allow us to develop that framework into theories and principles. And therefore, finally, in the premises, the phenomena is the best base for studies and action from an Islamic point of view. And you see here networks of action that are connected to networks of studies or scholarship, or what you can call ijtihad in Arabic. And therefore, al-ijtihad could be best useful if we connect al-ijtihad to organization and movement and action on the ground that is trying to change the status quo related to a particular phenomenon. Because that's how you can go beyond disciplines. Yes, you learn through a discipline if you're going to be specialized, but if you're going to deal with the reality, you have to have a multidisciplinary and rather, as I'm saying, a transdisciplinary approach that is based on the Islamic framework. Let me start with that framework by going into the definition of fiqh. Basically, we define fiqh normally with the definition in black rather than the one in red. And then I added the words in red here for usul al-fiqh al-maqasidi, or the maqasid fundamental theory, if you wish. The fundamental theory is dealing with the book and the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and giving judgments related to individual actions usually. And the process is carried out in light of al-adilla tafsiriyya, or the specific revealed evidence. With a maqasid, or a comprehensive or a purpose-based framework, we are really talking about the induction of the methodological objectives, and through which you form a composite perception or a framework. And that framework is supposed to be added to our usul, or our fundamental theory, because if we don't do at-tasawwur, what the fuqaha call at-tasawwur, we cannot do at-tasarruf. If we don't have the right perception of the reality, then we cannot really act in the reality in the most efficient way. And that is the importance of the framework, or the composite perception, or tasawwur murakkab in Arabic. And this would deal with not just the individual and family law and so forth. This will deal with every public event and every phenomena that we see in our life on earth, because the framework would deal with not just the fiqh in the ethical sense, but fiqh in the policy sense, fiqh in the action sense, fiqh in the literature or art sense, fiqh in every sense of action. Because Islam is not just for, again, the rules that individuals follow, but it is for every kind of organization, civil or government, in order to deal with the phenomena and the reality on the ground. And therefore, we go beyond the disciplines as scholars of Islam in that particular sense. When we try to look for those methodological objectives, the question we ask is, what does the revelation aim to achieve, methodologically speaking? So when we read al-qasas of the Quran, or we read the similes, or the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we read about the laws or the unseen matters or the messages, what are the aims of the Quran from a methodological perspective? And after some details and istiqra and induction and so on, we realized that these are the objectives here. To realize the objective, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us We have to fast so that we realize taqwa. We have to pray so we realize nahi an al-fahsha'i wal munkar, avoiding sin. We have to do the dhabiha for the sake of the poor. We have to give zakah in order for these 7 or 8 different aspects of zakah to be realized. So the realization of maqasid is one of the aspects. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us al-qasas, the stories, so that we realize certain objectives in our lives based on the lessons from these stories. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also methodologically correcting our concepts. This is good and this is evil. This is faith and this is hypocrisy. This is reform on earth and this is corruption on earth. Corruption on earth cannot be achieved through usury, but the reform on earth is going to be achieved through buying and selling and trade and so on. This is the right definition of family. This is the right definition of neighborhood. This is the right definition of community. This is the right definition of Islam. Islam is not just the deen of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Islam is the deen of every prophet and the story of faith throughout history and so forth. So therefore, the Quran here is correcting our concepts, and the Prophet ﷺ, obviously in his hadith, is also correcting our concepts. It's also classifying groups. The belief is divided into believers and disbelievers and hypocrites and people who don't know about the belief. The group that is called al-ulama, the Quran is talking about and is giving us a picture on how we define those. And the group that is called ulama, for example, is related to the concept that is called al-ilm, or knowledge. And knowledge in Islam is a comprehensive concept. It's not just the knowledge of fiqh. Fiqh is one aspect of knowledge. But you could be a biologist in Islam and you're called ulama too. In fact, the word ulama that is mentioned in the context, for example, إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاء, is mentioned in the context of natural phenomena and natural sciences. Therefore, al-mafahim, or the concepts, correct our definition of al-fi'at, or the groups. The group that is called al-hukam, or the governors, وَتُدْلُوا بِهَا إِلَى الْحُكَّامِ, or ulil amr, people of command. People of command are not just people of force. People of command are people of authority based on justice and based on seeking common good. There is a difference between ulil amr, or people of the command in you, or a government, and tyrants. At-taghut. At-taghut is different. They both have command, but Al-Quran is fixing that definition of concepts and of groups for us, in order for us to see Pharaoh in the right light and to see the just rulers like the Queen of Sheba in the right light. Aligning with universal laws is one of the higher methodological objectives of Al-Wahi, or the revelation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that everything is nations or communities like us, umamun amthalukum, and therefore this is a universal law. There is nothing that walks on earth or flies in the air except being being a community. A community means what? According to the Quran, a community means language. A community means family relations, or mates and so forth, azwaj, zawjiyya. In fact, another law, وَمِن كُلِّ شَيْءٍ خَلَقْنَا زَوْجَيْنِ, everything is made in pairs, and so forth. As-sunan, the sunan al-nasr, how to gain victory on any level, has laws. Sunan al-rizq, how to be provided. Sunan, the al-umamiyya, al-rizq, al-nasr, al-zawjiyya, sunan al-tawasul, everything is connected. And if we sever the connections, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considers this to be fasadun fil ard, or corruption on earth. That is a sunnah. ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس ليذيقهم بعض الذي عملوا. The corruption happens on earth because of what people do. But otherwise, Earth is balanced. وَأَنبَتْنَا فِيهَا مِنْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ مَوْزُونٍ. Earth is balanced and everything is going in harmony. But we corrupt Earth because of what we do. This is a view of the universal laws, and the objective here is to align ourselves with the universal laws. Following the values, also, the Quran is teaching us about particular values, and we will see the kinds of values as we go in some detail. The values of benefit, something that benefits or harms you. So there is a value and the opposite of it. And the value of morality or virtue, in English, different words, but in Arabic would be al-khuluq, the virtue or the ethics that you come from. Mercy being the highest of these values, generosity, courage, etc., being kind to your parents and neighbors and so on. So many values that the Quran is teaching us through the examples of certain prophets. You learn chastity from Prophet Yusuf. You learn courage from Prophet Dawood. You learn wisdom from Prophet Sulaiman. You learn everything from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so forth. لقد كان لكم في رسول الله أسوة حسنة. You have a good example. You have the good moral value that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam teaches you. Values also includes beauty. So we're talking about benefit and morality and beauty. Beauty is a value in Islam. وَلَكُمْ فِيهَا جَمَالٌ حِينَ تُرِيحُونَ وَحِينَ تَسْرَحُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that animals give you beauty when you relax and just look at the animals. We notice that those who are animal loving or pet loving, you see that there is a jamal, there is a beauty here, that is a maqsood, that is an objective that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put from the creation of these creatures like that. خُذُوا زِينَتَكُمْ عِنْدَ كُلِّ مَسْجِدٍ. Take your ornaments when you go to a mosque. That is an objective in its own right, and in order to see the beauty. Even the Prophet ﷺ in the hadith that we know, when he saw a grave and a brick is missing, he asked them to put the brick back so that it's beautiful this way. Even if you build a grave, it has to be beautiful. It has to be has to have ihsan or excellence. Beauty in that sense is not just material beauty, but sabrun jamil, patience with beauty. So a beautiful patience. فإمساك بمعروف أو تسريح بإحسان. So a beautiful divorce, even though it's a nasty event that happens, Allah forbid, in some families, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ordering us for this to be beautiful and not ugly. So beauty is another value here that methodologically the Quran is achieving, aiming to achieve. And then proofs, which has to do with logic and avoiding fallacies and so on. We'll discuss a few of this, and acting on commands in that sense. And therefore, if we take let's say the elements out from these maqasid, and we take only the objectives and concepts, groups, universal laws, values, proofs, and commands, we will be able to build a framework that includes these 7 elements, and I'll give some details as time will permit, inshallah. And that framework would allow us to read the revelation and reflect upon it in a particular way that applies to our reality. We look for the concepts in the revelation and compare them to the concepts we have in our reality and have a dialogue in order to adjust our concepts and correct our concepts as the Quran aims to achieve. We look at the objectives of humanity and the objectives of the ummah and the objectives of the individual from the Quran, and then we see how much I am meeting my objectives as an individual or as an ummah or as a humanity, and therefore we try to rectify ourselves towards the objectives. We look at the groups and how they're classified and try to correct that, and the universal laws and values and commands and so on. So then the methodology would have those 5 major steps: defining the question or the phenomenon under study, and then we go into cycles of reflection in order to create the framework through which we can deal with the phenomena or the question. And then we start to relate the analysis between the different elements of the framework, the objectives and the rules and the concepts and the groups and so forth, through the relationships between the elements of the framework. Then we can deal with the reality by developing principles and theories on how to deal with the reality. It's very important to theorize before we deal with the reality, because there is no action without a philosophy behind it, and there is no system or organization without a value system and a conceptual framework for that organization. And if we don't think about our conceptual framework and our value system, we're going to fall prey to a different value system or a different conceptual framework. And therefore, we end up going against the Islamic objectives if we are not going to be careful with the framework through which we deal with the reality. Number 4 is to do a critical discussion with two parts of our literature or our theories, the Islamic and the non-Islamic. The difference between the Islamic and the non-Islamic is where you come from, is the framework again. The Islamic framework could be a different framework from this, or could be the same framework. We have to have a dialogue with what we have in Islam. The history of our thought, the history of our law, as well as the current law and the current thought that we have in Islam. And then people who come from a non-Islamic perspective, they come from a utilitarian background, or from a deconstructionist background, or from whatever it is, the philosopher that they follow, Hume or Rawls or any of the non-Islamic philosophers. I'm not saying that they are bad, but they are not Islamic. Then we have to deal with them based on a common ground that we seek, yes, but we cannot take everything they say without a filter of critique through the Islamic framework. And then we go back and redefine the question, or if we are able, we can answer it. And this is how the methodology works through the framework. Let me give a few additional comments on this. To define the question is to evaluate the challenges and opportunities based on how consistent or inconsistent the situation is with the objectives. So if we take the objectives of humanity, for example, the maqsad of worshipping Allah, the maqsad of dignifying humanity, let's say, and see how Islam dignifies humanity, and then we see how the system of human rights dignifies humanity, and then we see how much we fall short between what Islam is aiming to achieve and what the system of human rights aim to achieve. For example, the system of human rights is a legal system when it comes to dignity. Islam approaches dignity in a much more comprehensive way. Dignity in Islam is not a legal concept. Dignity is a faith concept, actually. We have a faith in Allah that He dignified every son and daughter of Adam, a basic dignity. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. But then in Islam, we can increase in dignity if we increase in faith. إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. The most dignified amongst you is the most pious, or the most heedful of Allah. So yes, there is a basic dignity for all human beings, but we seek more dignity through our faith and through belief and through good action. And dignity is not just for the current generation. We also look at the next generations, and we also look at the non-economic factors in dignity. And dignity is protected through a framework of sanctions in Islam, and so forth. When we look at rectifying earth, we are not exploiting earth. We are doing islah. We are using from earth what we can use, but earth has a sanctuary. We cannot fish by explosions, for example. We cannot eat these wild animals in Islam. We cannot destroy the infrastructure of a forest or of the sea, the marine life for that matter, in order for us to have some economic benefits. This is, according to the Quran, fasadun fil ard, corruption on earth. And this will backfire, as we see today. The backfiring, not just with the COVID epidemic, but with many things, that the earth is backfiring because of the corruption, because how we deal with the environment, and how we deal with the economy, and how we deal with humanity in general. And because of that, we are going through a phase of trial. Because the economy is defined this way, people are starving when they don't work for a week. And because we deal with the natural resources this way, the global warming is a real threat, and mudslides are everywhere, and so forth. That is how we can assess the reality, through a framework of maqasid, and that's how we can define the question. Secondly, then we go through the objectives, the concepts, the groups, the universal laws, values, proofs, commands, and of course a cycle of reflection upon the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to tie that to the Quran. And the sunnah, by the way, for those who are non-specialized, is not endless. The sunnah of Muhammad ﷺ that we have as hadith narrations is about 3,000 to 4,000 hadith that could be put in a good sized book, similar to the Quran, really. If you eliminate all the repetitions and all of that, Imam As-Suyuti had done that research, and in our time, Sheikh Salih al-Shami, Jazallahu khairan, has put in his book Ma'alim al-Sunnah, after removing all the repetitions, you have about 4,000 hadith. So with the Quran and the hadith, if you go through a cycle of reflection, you will look for these elements, and then you start to build a framework. There are many details in the slides, which I sent to my brothers. I think there was a technical glitch, but I'll send the slides again, inshallah. You have more details here about how you discover al-maqasid, the expressions of maqasid, through the topics, through the expression, direct expression, the indirect expressions, the thematic maqasid, the maqasid of the revelational semantics, the maqasid of the figuratives, the maqasid of the rhetoric. And then, I mean, you can look at the maqasid of why the Quran is in Arabic, why do we have taqwa, and then you start to build a network of meaning through this exercise. You look at the mafahim, or the concepts. Every name is a concept. Bismillah, the name of Allah. Allah is the first concept that the Quran is giving us, subhanahu wa ta'ala. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. The name, وعلم آدم الأسماء كلها. These names, any word in the Quran is a potential concept that means something and has authority. هي الأسماء سميتموها أنتم وآباؤكم ما نزل الله بها من سلطان. ما أنزل الله بها من سلطان. Sultan and authority. Every name in the Quran, every word has an authority, has a concept. And that concept will lead us through forming a conceptual framework that is Islamic. Here there are some expressions of the concepts, the composite concepts, the fields of concepts, and so forth. Some, technical expressions here of concepts. Al-ibadah as a concept is tied to a number of objectives and a number of groups and a number of awamir or commands and so forth. And then expressions of al-fi'at, or the groups, expressions of al-sunnah al-ilahiyya in the same sense in the Quran, and expressions of al-qiyam, as I mentioned, utility, morality, and beauty, explicit mentions, implicit mentions of value in the Quran and Sunnah, al-hujaj, fallacies, for example, such as the fallacy of irrelevance, false causality, personal attack, popularity argument, power of authority, avoiding an elusive consequence, and so forth. Like, I don't want to get into logic here, but basically the Quran is teaching us the logical framework that we can follow in order not to follow in the fallacies, to fall into fallacies that negate our truth in the logic, al-haq, in our logic. And then to express the awamir, the commands, and obviously an-nawahi, the commands and the forbidances and prohibitions. And we have two levels, the general commands and prohibitions. لا إكراه في الدين كل نفس بما كسبت رهينة. They're like rules and maxims. And under that, we have a number of detailed commands. So now this is what we end up getting, a network of meaning, where we are writing al-maqasid wal-mafahim wal-fi'at wal-sunan wal-qiyam wal-hujaj wal-awamir. And through that, we can start to build a framework and then start to analyze the different relationships, details here between these networks of meanings in order to start to look at theories and so forth. We end up with something like that, which I'm here copying from the Maqasid research network that we do in the Maqasid Institute. We have a research network of meanings in which our researchers are working on. This is still in-house work. We haven't published that website or involved researchers from the public. It's just internal work of the Maqasid Institute, where we are connecting all of this in a network of meaning that will be at the core of research networks that will work on different phenomena that concern the Ummah, so that we come up with solutions. And then we can have theories. This is a theory of the heart, for example, in Islam. The heart in Islam is not just a pump. It has actions that it does, and it has states that it goes through, and so forth. So it's a whole theory. And therefore, then we can really reconstruct the chapters of Islamic scholarship based on the theories that we come up. Then we can have this critical discussion between what we come up with and the Islamic and non-Islamic frameworks and theories. It's very important that we criticize those two areas. The Islamic framework that we have inherited, and criticism is not bad, is not negative. Criticism is to really see how we can improve on ourselves as Muslims. And it's very important also to criticize what we have as status quo philosophy and status quo systems in our world today, because oftentimes we're apologetic about today. We're apologetic about the economic system and its ribawi basis and usury basis and so forth. So we try to make hila or legal tricks from Islam to justify an economic system. But maybe it's best for the economic system if we criticize it from an Islamic point of view and suggest ways of improving it. Oftentimes we are apologetic or we are schizophrenic, like we live Islam in the mosque and then we live the world according to the world. Islam is neither. Islam is neither apologetic nor schizophrenic. Islam is rebuilding and reconstructing our understanding and our systems in the world. I'm just going to skip some examples here that I'm giving here some details with. And therefore, then we redefine the question. If the question now is how to deal with the epidemic, after building the Islamic framework, perhaps we can redefine the question or redefine the answer. If we look at the sunan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the universal laws, if we look at why the pandemic is an issue, what happened that led us to where we are? We live in a time of crisis, but why is the crisis economic and social and family, and family violence is on the rise, and why is the crisis multifold versus a normal crisis of pandemics that come and go and then we deal with in a medical way? Perhaps then we can redefine the question and reconstruct our thinking in order for the Islamic approach to be a useful approach and add something to the current debates on various dimensions of what we have. I will basically stop here because there is a lot of slides that I have on ijtihad and so on that we could talk about. But basically, the point is to link the phenomena. This is a network of phenomena here, that we can link the phenomena together in order to be able to study the phenomena properly and to have an Islamic approach that is integrative and comprehensive, and therefore, inshallah, useful when we deal with phenomena. I will stop here, and inshallah, I'm hoping that the Q&A would give us a chance to interact. I'm hoping that you can see me clearly and hear me clearly. جزاكم الله خير. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Jasser. I know this is very intense material to try to introduce in 40 minutes, but I think it gave us something to open the floor for intervention and idea and questions. People tell us that they want to spend more time with the speakers in the interaction, and so this is pretty good introduction here. I'll open the floor now, so please you can raise your hand to intervene, or you could write on the chat. I see Dr. Mustafa Abdul Wahid from Boston ready to intervene. Bismillah.
Salam alaikum. I have a question
Alaikum salam.
based on I think that you have a lot of things to share with us about the al-maqasid and the objectives. My question is there anything similar or additive to what is going on in the most prestigious university in their Department of Theologies? For those who are a little interested about comparative theologies, I heard from what you said a lot of what we can read or learn from what is going on, like at Harvard School of Divinity, for example, or Department of Theology in Chicago. Those people also are very interested about solving, dealing, approaching universal questions in the same way you are talking about objectives. So did you spend some time to see what is similar or in parallel to what's going on, especially in the most open and no prestigious department? Those who are literally liberal and they are interested about many good things that could benefit the whole humanity.
والله جزاك الله خير. جزاك الله خير. أهلا وسهلا. I haven't been updating myself recently because I'm very busy with dealing with the Quran over the past perhaps 3 years or 4 years, but I'm quite familiar with the studies of theology in general in the West. And as you said, Akhi, it's very true that some approaches to theology are very similar to this, coming from different perspectives. It's very important, though, that Muslims bring the Islamic perspective, because every perspective has something to add. I think the Quranic concepts of earth and the rectification of earth, Islah al-Ard, and the role of faith and so on, there is a lot of common ground, obviously, but I think Muslims have to focus on what they can add. I'm asked this question sometimes, what can we add instead of repeating what other people say? So I think the Islamic contribution is important, not just because Muslims are, 1 out of every 4 persons on earth, but because the Quranic message is unique. Yes, it is similar to the messages before that, and anything that is true in the messages before that will be true according to the Quran too. But it also adds a more updated and a faith-based approach that could be useful, inshallah. So I totally agree with you, and I encourage this kind of dialogue, because that's when we self-criticize, and that's when we can add, inshallah, something that hopefully would enrich the dialogue.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Allah bless.
While people are gathering their thought and writing their question, I'm just gonna ask a question to Dr. Jasser.
Sure.
I notice in the Maqasid Maqasid methodology that you exposed, a lot of similarity with the design thinking process, where it requires for people to empathize, to define the question, to ideate by getting into brainstorming sessions, and then prototype, and then test that prototype. This is the classical design thinking 5 steps. Is that was there any inspiration from that, or?
I think so. You mentioned, CD, in my introduction that I have a PhD in IT. Actually, my PhD is not in IT. It's in systems analysis. From University of Waterloo, Systems Analysis and Design Department. That's like one hat that I have. And then the other hat was the PhD I did in the UK on Islamic philosophy and so on. So basically, I think that the systems approach is something that I swallowed and cannot get out, as they said about Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, Abu Hamid. They said he studied Greek philosophy, so he swallowed it, and it never came out of his stomach, even though at the end he criticized the Greek philosophers and all of that. But to me, Imam Abu Hamid is a Greek philosopher at the end. I am hoping, Allahu A'lam, I am hoping that I'm not projecting my systems background on the Quran, and I'm hoping that what I am reading through this, and the researchers in the Maqasid Institute with me, I'm hoping that we are trying to read a genuine system here, rather than projecting our ideas. It is a Quranic idea to do cycles of reflection. And أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ. Tadabbur is to look at something from its back after it goes. So basically, a cycle. Yeah. And when you look at defining the objectives and the concepts and so on, yes, it's a very systematic view to define the conceptual framework. And it's very recent, actually, in cognitive theory and all of that. But the Quran defines al-asma for us, and kalimat. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. And then the Quran in many places says, ويقولون هو من عند الله وما هو من عند الله. ألا إنهم هم المفسدون ولكن لا يشعرون. It corrects the concept of reform, the concept of faith, the concept of usury, the concept of this. So I'm reading into the Quran, perhaps from my systems background, I'm influenced with that, but I'm hoping that what we read is genuine, because our evidence is really the revelation to start with. And every other evidence is secondary as we read the revelation. But yeah.
Jazakallah khairan. I have here a question from Sister Amani. She's been asking to talk to you from our previous sessions. She said, I'm going to read the question or the comment. Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Jasser. Very informative session. My question is, what is the knowledge necessary for being a member of consensus? And why did you recommend to connect ijtihad with organizations?
The consensus, to me, or if you're talking about al-ijma', to me is a tool of ijtihad and not a source of sharia. يعني the sources of sharia are the Quran and Sunnah. Then after the Quran and Sunnah, I prefer, when I teach usul al-fiqh, I prefer to call them adawat al-ijtihad, tools of ijtihad. So al-ijma', to see the consensus of scholars in a particular area or a particular fiqh council or something, what is the general consensus of the scholars? And that would give strength for that. So what is it to be a member of the consensus group? Is to be a mujtahid. But I believe that every Muslim is a mujtahid at a particular level of knowledge, because every Muslim has a particular level of knowledge. If I'm a very basic Muslim, I do ijtihad in, looking at the sun. Is it sunset yet? So I can break my fast. Is the water clean so I can make wudu with it? That is ijtihad. But at a basic level of what we call in fiqh at-tanzil, or the application, applied ijtihad. And if I'm a scholar and I start to have different levels or higher levels of knowledge, then I do ijtihad based on my knowledge. In this methodology, though, the ijtihad is not just for fuqaha, it's not just for jurists. Ijtihad is for everybody who is specialized, and therefore they come to the table of ijtihad with a particular knowledge, and therefore they can add something. We do that in the Majami' al-Fiqh. I remember, as my brother mentioned, of a couple of fiqh councils. We bring sometimes an expert to talk. But this methodology goes beyond that. The expert here is part of the ijtihad process. Is not just somebody who can give me half an hour on I don't know, genetic engineering. And then because of my jurisprudence background, I don't really understand his language. I don't have the conceptual framework. Here, the physician himself or the surgeon himself will have a conceptual framework based on their own ijtihad, and then they could come and talk more effectively to the questions of fiqh, because they built a conceptual framework that is merged into their background of biology or medicine or politics or economics or any of that. But the mashayikh don't understand politics. So when you deal with questions of politics, you need a political scientist. You need somebody who understands what a modern nation state is, and institutions and separation of power and all of that. And sometimes we as people of jurisprudence don't understand the separation of power. So we speak to questions of politics without knowledge really of how a modern state works. We think that a president could stop something in the court, but this is different in a democracy, I mean, and so forth. So the issue of ijma' then is tied to ijtihad in that sense, but this methodology endeavors to open the door of ijtihad to every person of knowledge to add to the ijtihad that we as Muslims are required to do.
Very good. I'll come back to you, Mustafa. Last week, we were talking about the response of religions to the pandemic crisis. And one of the responses that we were talking about is the response of the mufti and the scholars and the majalis fatwa. And unfortunately, we took a case where a question came and asking about who to prioritize when you have scarcity of equipment to save lives. And the one scholar say, well, you take them first come, first serve. And the majma' attempted to help, but they kind of delegated back the question to the physician who's asking by telling them follow your hospital protocol. And this was a disastrous response. It shows that whoever responded have no clue about what goes on. And I think really it goes both ways. I think I really appreciate the fact that we need to get the specialists in their fields to understand the framework so they can be beneficial to this discourse.
I totally agree with you, Doctor, but let me comment on this too. This is very true. I, as a member of the European Council of Fatwa and the Tahad al-Ulama al-Muslimin and so on, when I'm asked about something, I give them the European Council of Fatwa because I'm not qualified to delve into this. So that's a problem I have as somebody who is a member of these councils. And in the council, we don't have doctors who are qualified to deal with that, and sometimes we deal with it in a hurried way. I totally agree with you, but the doctor who is going to talk about this, or the ethicist, has to have training in the Islamic methodology, so they don't end up treating the issue on a non-Islamic basis. You see, the problem is that once we get into that, what kind of code are you going to follow? If you tell me I'm going to follow, the British Association of this or the American Association of that, no, I disagree, because they come from a methodology that is not Islamic. Yes, there is a commonality with Islam in many ways, but as Muslims, we approach things different. We need a genuine approach. So we do not want the typical faqih approach that deals based on the madhahib al-fiqh and so on. That is obviously not efficient and not useful and not Islamic really. And we really don't want the doctor who is trained in a different philosophy and views the human being as a bunch of instruments, let's say, views the heart as a pump and just replace the pump and put the pump, but doesn't take the effort to describe the heart properly as it is described in Islam, and to describe life and death, let's say, if we're talking about transplantation or any of that, let's say, not to describe life and death based on the law, because the law that, for example, brain death. I don't want to get into a technical issue here, but this is an issue that I researched particularly with a group of doctors through the Fiqh Council of North America. Therefore, I have something to say about it. The rules that define brain death are economic rules. They are not ethical or religious. And why? Because we need to harvest the organs and so on. That's not an Islamic view. The Islamic view is, yes, you can use the organs, and of course it could be a charity, but the person has to be dead. What is death? That is a theological question that the best answerer for would be a doctor. But a doctor not trained in just the American system and telling me, well, as a doctor told me in one of the seminars, but this is the definition of death in the American law. I said, but we're discussing Islamic law here, not the American law. You see, it could be Islamic, but we need to critique that. So just to add that if you're going to approach Islam, if you're going to approach the issues from a non-fiqhi point of view, don't bring me Rawls and Hume and John Locke and Nietzsche, and then you tell me that you're going to approach it from an Islamic point of view.
Right.
You have to have your own methodology.
Actually, this is a discussion that needs another session by itself. But I have a couple of people waiting to ask a question. I have Dr. Kunduz from, I believe, Michigan. Salam and thank you. You mentioned submitting the knowledge from so-called non-Islamic, between quote, philosophers and scholars to the Islamic framework before accepting it or not. But shouldn't the measure be evidence and logic, particularly since most of the Muslim conceptual framework is a human one, not talking about the sacred text that is Quran? I am nor referring here to the old issue of reason versus revelation.
Yeah, I totally agree about that the Islamic view, if it is human, if it is basically fiqh or fikr or a human endeavor, then the evaluation of it is how close it is to the revelation. And the revelation is not human. I differ with that. The revelation is not, and yes, it will be read by a human, but there is a difference between reading the revelation and reading the books of fiqh, the books of history, of Islamic literature. These are two different readings. So people who talk about al-aql wal-naql, today, like our brothers in Malaysia, have a lot of seminars and in the whole university about al-aqli wal-naqli and all of that. And naql here, there are two different kinds of naql. There is the naql of the turath, or the heritage that we have, and there is the naql of the revelation, or al-wahi. I differentiate between al-turath wal-wahi. The revelation has clear injunctions. The revelation is not unclear or too general or just very basic. That is a wrong conception of the revelation of the Quran. Unfortunately, people who do not give enough time to study the Quran, sometimes they think that the Quran is not a useful source of knowledge, unfortunately, and doesn't have nothing to say about economic questions or questions of society or even questions of design or questions of the environment. No, it has a lot to say, but we need to tathwir al-Quran, as Imam Ali said, we need to investigate, we need to analyze. And yes, the evidence in the logic in Rawls or Kant has to be judged based on the Islamic premises. And the Islamic premises, I mean the original ones, not the historical ones. So we cannot just simply apply Rawls as he is just because he's talking about justice, because he comes from a perspective that is on the premises of it is non-Islamic. It could agree with some Islamic injunctions, but it disagree with some. So yes, I insist on the, if you wish, the epistemological importance of the revelation, not of the Islamic history, of the revelation as a basis of our ijtihad, and the ontological and the logical as well. Not just, so every if you want to speak that Western language, every philosophical dimension of our investigation has to come from an Islamic source. Allah.
Very good. Muhammad Bilyamani, go ahead.
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much,
Video,
Dr. Jasser.
put your video.
Oh, you want
Good to
my
see you,
video?
subhanallah.
Awesome. One sec.
Unless you're totally in your pajamas and all of
No,
that.
no, I can be seen. Don't worry. Barakallahu fik. So just I really like I have concise point here, and I like your just some comment or some elaboration in terms of that matter. You mentioned the cycle kind of reflection to be created in order to have this cycle of reflection operation. So in order to have the cycle of reflections, it needs to be done by somebody. This somebody could be kind of, and this is where I want to have more clarity or to have my comment here. I mean, who's doing this cycle of reflections it should be, and I like the point that you are opening it up. It's not about the fuqaha, it's not about the scholars per se, it's not about the natural people per se. It's all people are involved in the problem or are involved in the situation, are part of the circle of reflection in order to do that reflection. Now there is manhajiyya, or there is a framework between them, so they are not kind of playing a game against each other. They are coming with there is common ground to do this cycle of reflections, which you introduce as premises and you put it as one of your kind of steps as manhajiyya or methodology. So just to elaborate on this cycle, and I think that's one of the area that we are suffering from it at our time and dealing with this pandemic, as we are inviting people, and this series is all about inviting people to do this reflection about this phenomena that we have here, and please, let's do it. And that's where we can feel the level of success of it, or the level of the obstacles that we are facing. And I'm referring here, what is required for those for those groups that are running the cycle of reflections to have as ground, and I'm referring here to the theory of kind of collective intelligence concept elaborated based on, you need some level of expertise on the question, and you need some level of the platform to play on it, and you need some level of tools. So this is the three kind of concepts that they are bringing together to define, this is collective intelligence that can get to some beneficial outcome. Just I want to bring your thought here in this area, and to elaborate a little bit better, to address the concern we have in this series, to kind of increase the effectiveness of having this cycle of reflection regarding the pandemic. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair. In addition to the tools you're mentioning and the communication means and so forth, and the research questions, it's very important to address the topic of Islamic education. I think we can try, inshallah, on Thursday. I have a plan to try to do some deliberation with my brothers and sisters and so forth. But I think in order for this to be effective, we have to educate the Islamic scholar or the Muslim scholar from the beginning in a particular pedagogy, in a particular curriculum that is different from the way we educate people today. Today, our Islamic education is coming from a secular perspective. It teaches theology, as in hadith and fiqh and tafsir and so forth, siyasa shar'iyya, da'wah, lugha arabiyya. And it's usually the history of that, the history of fiqh and the history of ulum al-hadith and ulum al-tafsir and so forth. Versus a Muslim who goes to a college and studies tibb wal handasa, engineering, physics, biology, I think this whole economic system has to be reconstructed in order for this deliberation to be most effective. it has to be reconstructed according to basic phenomena that we have that would define the disciplines. Because disciplines so far are defined economically, and economics is fine, but it's not knowledge. A discipline defines a professional who is very specialized and very effective in what they do, but it doesn't define a knowledgeable person. A graduate, even with a PhD in medicine or engineering or history for that matter, doesn't know much more than what they study. It doesn't guarantee that they have enough knowledge to get into a deliberation of that kind. So therefore, like the work we do in South Africa as the Maqasid Institute, we are trying to redefine Islamic education through the Peace University that we are contributing to over there, in order for the colleges to be defined according to phenomena, rather than dividing the colleges according to your good old medicine and economics and anthropology and so forth. The colleges are defined Islam in Africa, governance, the College of Social Justice, and so forth. And under social justice, then you can study so many things rather than just dealing with the disciplines. So I agree with you, but I think Islamic education has to be reconstructed for this to be effective, really.
I wanted to come back to Mustafa Abdulwahid because it's Maghrib time in there. Mustafa, briefly, because I have other comments coming.
Very, very briefly, just to tell you, we have a member in our community, Adnan, who is engineering in finance, and he spent few years in Wall Street. For a personal reason, he is doing his 4th-year PhD philosophy in Islam in Boston University. But there are some people maybe who will follow your journey in being in kind of science expert and move into something that could be interesting for Islam. My question has to do with, we don't have time, maybe another time, to share with us your best applied case, coming with all what you explained to your theories and teamwork, etc., and you come with some applications. Because redefining the question after the whole process of spending time and energy, maybe it's like a little awakening. I hope that there is some proof of concept cases where you applied your school of Maqasid objective. The last thing I want to ask, if you can answer very short, related to linguistic in Quran. Yesterday I was part of a Zoom here with some members community, just to trigger, to provoke some, as we say, to get to some transcending way of thinking. I asked them, do you have any idea about the meaning of Alif, Lam, Mim, Ha, Sad? And we all know that there is no explanation so far from what we inherited as explanation. And I was listening to them, and no one gave me any idea about how to just to think about the meaning of this word that we found in the beginning of a few surah. So is there anything done in your...
Before you answer, Dr. Jasser, I think the first question could be tackled on Thursday.
Okay.
Because it's dealing with the case studies and
Absolutely.
If you could briefly address the second question so we could go to other people.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just going to say that. I mean, not just Thursday, but we could agree on some other event where we have this showcasing of applications and so on, because it requires other researchers to be involved, perhaps from the Maqasid Institute, and show how they apply that to their field. The word you mentioned, Sidi, is Islam. I tried to mention that the concept of Islam in the lugha of the Quran, in the language of the Quran, is different from the way we say it in our cultures. Islam is the religion of every prophet. What we call Christianity is originally Islam. Yes, some followers of Jesus worshipped him. We don't agree with that. The Quran is saying that this is shirk, or associating others with Allah, but others are Muslims. Inna kunna min qablihi muslimin. And so Islam, if you look at the history of Islam as the history of faith, not just the Umayyads and Abbasids and all of that, the history of faith all the way to Adam, that is a very different history of Islam. And Islam is even before Adam, because al-jinn could be Muslim and could be non-Muslim. And al-jinn were before us anyway. So when we find something 200 million years ago, whatever, other creations that Allah created, there was Islam there as well. Allah is telling us.
Brother Dr. Sharif, please.
السلام عليكم جزاكم الله خير دكتور جاسر والأخوة جميعا. My point is related to the cycles of reflection to develop theories and principles, and all linguistic part related to that, which mean the Arabic terms and Islamic terms related to the Maqasid work. I just wanted to take your eyes to معهد الدراسات المصطلحية. This is an international معهد institute in فاس المغرب. دكتور الشاهد البوشيخي he started this work from a long time ago. He have, and Dr. Mustafa Fadil and a lot of brothers there, they are working hard to try to clear the concepts and terms from, let's say, historical point related to the Islamic perspectives. I think if you take a look there, inshallah ta'ala, it will support your work. And
absolutely. I'm familiar with the work of Sheikh Shahid Boushikhi. I read some of his books, and alhamdulillah, this is on the mafahim is very important. The mafahim side of what I talked about today, this is very important, the work they do. In fact, each one of these elements requires a center really to deal with. As-Sunan, al-Mafahim, al-Maqasid, and so forth. Jazakallah khair.
Sister Amani is asking Dr. Jasser, from your perspective, do you think that we need to do the renewing on all our Islamic knowledge? Because sometimes it is hard to do that on a specific field such as the Quranic methods.
Well, yeah, on all our Islamic knowledge, but the Quranic methods is at the core of that knowledge, because the Quran is the core of Islam, you see. Even if you're talking about ulum al-Sunnah, al-Sunnah revolves around the Quran, and the al-Fiqh revolves around the Quran, and so forth. So yes, all of the Islamic knowledge, the Islamic history, the Islamic Fiqh, the Islamic, and so forth, has to be reconstructed and renewed. And this is natural. There is nothing revolutionary about this. It's natural that every century brings new scholars who renew Islam in its sciences in a new way, with the revelation or al-wahy in the center of that.
All right. If
we have a session, inshallah, on Thursday, we can take more questions. We can tell the brothers, inshallah, and sisters.
Inshallah. Yeah, inshallah. We usually will send the case studies by email to all the attendees so they can start thinking about them. Inshallah, we'll talk about that after the iftar.
We have iftar here in about 5 minutes, but then inshallah, after the iftar, I'll talk with you, Doctor, and organize the exercise on Thursday, inshallah.
Excellent. Jazakumullah khairan, everybody. And for those whose iftar time come, enjoy your iftar. And we'll talk to you on Thursday, inshallah, everybody.
Inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.